the intro is over by now. Hello, good evening, good morning, maybe even depending on when you're watching this. I've seen the analytics. I know everyone's all over the place.
Good whenever you are.
Good whenever you are. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, and it's 9:03 p.m. here, which means that we're gonna talk about some Metroid. This is DialogBOX, and I am your host, Laughingboy LP. And right now, I am here with a cranberry cider because it's been a long day, even though I woke up at 12:30 in the afternoon today. I've been out and about. With me today, on our final episode of the month of Metroid, we've got streamer and content creator. You can find him over on YouTube as well as twitch.tv. We've got Tom Fawkes here with us tonight.
It's me. Yes, as he said, I am the Tom Fawkes, Let's Player, Smash Bros. Map maker, vlogger, and streamer. All of those things. Let's not get crazy.
Come on now. I would never sell any of my guests short. Everybody that's been on here has been fantastic in everything that they do, especially when it comes to talking video games and talking to me and pretending that we're all good friends. Look, check's gonna be a little late this time. It's been a rough month. Just got engaged and things are just tight.
Congratulations!
Thank you. I just thought
it took me a minute to realize that was part of the bit and not, or it took me a minute to think if you actually did get engaged or if that was part of the bit. There we go.
No, the problem with the bit is that it's very important and it makes a deceitful person out of me. So, no, I actually did. So it's fun.
So you did get engaged.
I did.
Okay. Still trying to wrap my head around that one.
Is he for real? Like, yeah. No,
I'm not saying and that's nothing against you as a person. It's me being like, is this still part of the bit?
No, exactly. I get it. I absolutely get it because I was thinking that in my head as I was going like, he'll either brush this off as a joke or he'll, either way, I'm glad that you said congratulations. That's the really important thing.
Well, it only good could come from it. Either we get a laugh or it was sincere. I'm glad it was the latter.
It is. Well, I mean, I laughed.
Well, I mean, if I was wrong, that's where the laugh would have come
from. So we've done quite a few episodes. I've done quite a few episodes so far about the month of Metroid, where we talk about each sequential game in the main series of the franchise. Parts 1 through 3 are already up on the channel. After this episode's over, if you want to go ahead and take a look, I've had a couple other different guests on the show, and we've talked about the first 3 games sequentially, and it's been all good fun. But we're gonna end it tonight with the last game, almost the last game in the series, in the main series at least, Metroid Fusion, which got released on 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. And then we didn't see hide nor hair of Samus Aran in the main series, at least for a good almost 20 years. But first, we're going to talk about your relationship with the franchise and kind of where you've been, what you've done in terms of playing the games, and your thoughts and feelings on it.
So I wasn't really well acquainted with the Metroid series. I first learned about Samus through Super Smash Bros. For the N64. As I'm sure quite a few people did that never played Metroid. I'm sure a lot of people got their intro to different Nintendo characters through Smash Brothers. And then my brother got Metroid Prime for the GameCube, and I didn't play terribly much of that. I think the most I ever really did was use the boost ball to just skate up and down that half pipe in one of the early areas. Yeah. But then I streamed. I think the first Metroid game I actually beat was Fusion. And that I did that on my own. Because I think that came with oh man. So because of the lack of content on the 3DS, Nintendo adopted an ambassador program for it, where if you bought your 3DS like early in its life cycle, they also gifted you a series of I think it was NES and Game Boy Advance games, and Metroid Fusion was one of them, and that's how I got my first taste of it. And I beat it through that. And then I played Super Metroid through the Wii U eShop on stream, and then Metroid Primes 1 through 3, and then Dread. So I don't have a lot of experience with the first 2 Metroid games, but I mean the the first two Metroid games are recapped in Super Metroid, so you're not missing terribly much. Those games weren't really about lore anyway.
Well, and they don't really. I would say up until Fusion and Dread, they don't do a lot of exposition, or they don't do a lot of text exposition. Some of it's done through like the instruction manual, and you kind of get like some background. And then Super Metroid, yeah, and it has its original intro, and then there's really no storytelling. There's no like additional plot threads other than just kind of witnessing things, and there's no dialogue really.
And the interesting thing about that as well is that in Fusion, because of the lack of voice acting, there's actually some internal dialogue from Samus, but it's all in text form.
Mm-hmm.
Just talking about like the AI and how it reminded her of Adam. But then in Fusion or in Dread, just because of all the voice acting in it, we only really get, I mean, spoilers for Metroid Dread, I guess, but she talks.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like there is vocal audio that could be conceived as language. So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, she talks.
Yep. And I mean, she's always had like since Prime, she's always had some kind of voice, or she's talked in some way, or not talked, but like made grunts, or
oh yeah. But like here is the first time I could think of Samus actually using actual language. Although I think,
just talking to a person, like,
well, I mean, I also consider Prime a different animal because it was developed by a different company.
Yeah.
But I think in Prime, I'm trying to remember who the voice actress is, because I always get her and Great Elisa mixed up. Pretty like very well known voice act. I'm trying to think. Samus voice actor. Everyone, it's probably gonna be like Dread. Well, it's Rebecca Denise for Dread, but there was another Samus voice actor for Jennifer Hale. There we go.
Oh yeah,
Jennifer Hale voiced Samus. I think it was only in Metroid, one of the Metroid Prime games, I think.
I'm thinking, or I'm assuming that it's probably Prime 3, because I remember that being a talking point for Prime 3 before it came out.
Yeah. And presumably because of like all like the grunts and whatnot, she provided the voice of Samus in the other Metroid Prime games as well. So she was the voice of Samus in Metroid Prime 2, Hunters for the DS, and Corruption. Oh. And the same grunts from those previous Metroid games appear in Prime Pinball as well.
I'm just thinking about that for a minute. So yeah, you actually wound up knocking out the first two questions I had, which was how did you first hear about it and the games in the series you played thus far. I think so it's interesting. I think it was Brawl. So in the last episode, I had Forrest Minish on, Rebecca Stone, and her first witnessing of the Metroid franchise was Smash Brothers Brawl, actually. And it's been fun to, again, what I really enjoy about doing these episodes is like seeing how the different backgrounds that everybody has in terms of games, and the fact that they either had or didn't have access. Like, your being able to play Fusion was because of the ambassador program of all things.
Yeah.
And it's such an exclusive little club. I have a friend that managed to buy a 3DS at launch, and because of that, he was also granted into the program, and he never gave up that 3DS.
I mean, the thing for in terms of that is for the ambassador program, like there was no shortage of 3DSs out there. I mean, like this is probably just before the time when people on the internet would use bots to buy up anything that was limited edition or new that was coming out. But the 3DS, because of its lack of launch titles, kind of had a very slow growth coming into it. And I think it suffered, at least in the beginning, I think it suffered a little bit from what the Wii U had, where people just thought it was an enhanced version of the DS as opposed to an entirely new system that played different games.
Right. Yep.
But yeah, it was the ambassador program was mostly just slow sales, not necessarily out of scarcity.
No, absolutely. It was a very interesting, because it was essentially an apology and a thank you. I do remember at some point they had come out with like this whole big thing of, we know that the 3DS isn't doing well. Here's what we're going to do to try to fix it. And for everyone who bought a 3DS before now, like, thank you. I'm sure you had a lot of fun with Super Street Fighter 4 3D and Steel Sub. But, we're going to give you all these games. And they were very true to their word. Except for the NES games, they said and kept their promise of nobody else is going to be able to touch these games. throughout the entire 3DS lifespan, no one had access to Game Boy Advance titles the way that they did.
It was just the ambassadors.
It was really
which
cool
is
for them
nuts.
to have done that. And yeah, you get a certificate in your 3DS. So.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's a certificate somewhere in the 3DS that does say like your 3DS is an ambassador 3DS.
Now I'm kind of wondering if because I've transferred my data up to newer versions of the 3DS, and I still have those GBA games on there because because it transfers. I wonder if that certificate is there too.
That would be the question. I don't know if the certificate travels between. So
if
you have your original one.
I do have the original one. I had to because of the transfer I had to format it. It actually became my capture DS.
Nice.
When that was available to be modded. But yeah, kind of gotten off track here a little bit in terms of Metroid though.
Yeah, a little bit, but it's a fun topic nonetheless. So
yeah.
Which game from the series so far is your favorite and why? And that can include Prime as well.
Oh man, that's a really tough one because like they all have their benefits. I'd say out of all the ones I played, probably Prime 3 would be pretty low on the list.
Okay.
It was the conclusion to the story, but like the one thing that draws me to Metroid, and I don't know why this is, but I like that feeling of isolation. Where it's just you as this bounty hunter against the elements of the world. There was a lot of talking in Prime 3. So I probably there's probably an amorphous ranking I have between Prime 1, Super Metroid, and Dread at this point. Dread was really well done.
Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the case with a lot of other people I've talked to. Where it's like, my favorite was this.
I can't. It's hard to rank them though. So I think it's probably like there's some sort of like between those three. I couldn't pick a favorite between really? Super Prime and Dread.
Okay, not a problem. Sometimes it's hard for me to kind of pick a particular favorite of anything, and most times if you give me the same top three, I will give you a different list every time.
I think it might depend on how far apart the asking is, because if I asked you now and then I asked you like a second after you answer, it's going to be the same things. Yeah,
probably. I mean, you never know. I could just do it for the bit. I mean, that's the thing though. Like, I found that most of the time, my favorite games tend to be the one that I play again and again. But now that I've gotten older, the reason why I do that is because they're short. So, it's, if I could say that Dragon Quest VIII is my favorite, but it's like 80 hours. So maybe I won't pick that one. Music, characters, themes. The Metroid franchise is very significant in terms of Nintendo franchises because it's very, very different in what it does. Out of all of those things that makes the Metroid franchise unique, what's one thing about it that interests you the most and keeps you coming back?
Oh man, I think the series just does a really good job in general of creating an overall atmosphere in terms of it, particularly Fusion and Dread kind of moving more towards the horror aspect. Like in Fusion, when you first see SAX for the first time, or in Dread when you first see your first actual encounter with an Emmy, not the tutorial lurching one. And like the tense music and the noises that the Emmy is making, and like the even in just like the and that's just for like the chase stuff. In terms of like being spotted, I think in terms of Fusion, it's been a while since I played, so my memory might not be 100% on this.
That's fair.
But in terms of Metroid Fusion, the I think SAX was only really the SAX was an insta kill without being an insta kill. SAX did a lot of damage, but I think her sight was actually based on sight as opposed to the Emmys that can hear you.
Yeah. So it was a little bit more basic. It kind of reminds me, SAX reminds me a lot of like Resident Evil 3, the original, with Nemesis being like a constant threat, but typically in most cases it was kind of, it would wait until a story beat happens and then here comes the thing.
Here comes Nemesis. Yeah.
Here comes SAX. So moving
The
on.
Emmys are just kind of part of the overall world, and like,
Yeah, they're persistent.
are we allowed to talk about Dread spoilers
Um,
on this, or should I avoid them?
I would avoid them.
Okay.
At least in terms of story. If there are gameplay mechanics, it just
Yeah,
depends.
they kind of play into both.
Yeah. I mean, we will talk about, and this is a good point before I move on to the next part, but we will be talking about spoilers for Fusion at the very least. That's kind of what we've been doing the last 3 episodes as well. So if you haven't played Fusion, you gotta break out the Wii U, dust that thing off.
I mean, if you even plan on playing it,
exactly,
honestly, because it's yeah, like a lot of those games aren't really very easy to get a hold of anymore. Particularly like the Game Boy Advance ones in particular. They give the I mean, like there's plenty of access to the original Metroid, but it hasn't aged well. And even then, like there's a big chunk of the story missing that they added in Zero Mission.
Yeah, but good luck finding a legit copy of Zero Mission and Fusion.
Super Metroid is everywhere, and I'm pretty honestly. Well, we do have Samus Return, so we might get a remake of Super Metroid at some point in the future. And if that happens, I would love to see it done in a more 2D art style. I would actually kind of love to see it in the art style that like Octopath Traveler was done in.
More
like sprites with very atmospheric 3D graphics.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. That would be interesting. I know, especially with Mercury Steam, kind of focuses more on like everything's 3D polygonal models. But doing
we'll see if they come back for the next one.
We'll see. It kind of milkshake ducked. So going into Metroid Fusion, again, released in 2002, it's been
19 years.
19 years?
Yes. Pardon the squeaking, by the way.
Nah, we love cute dogs. 19 years since between Super and Fusion?
No, between Fusion and Dread.
Probably between Fusion and Dread's been 19 years. Between Super and Fusion,
it was 8 years between Super and Fusion. Yeah, 1994 for Super Metroid.
So we've got
on the copyright.
Yeah. So we've got the time gap there, and that's actually pretty significant considering the fact that we haven't seen Samus in a long time, and when we do finally see Samus, she's very different than what she used to be. I'm
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, not only has her appearance been altered with the fusion suit, but also getting rid of her ship and replacing it with one that has a much more sleek and more alien design. Even the logo's been changed to be significantly different in contrast to earlier games and Prime. So.
I mean, supposedly, like in terms of story elements for that, supposedly the reason why her ship is destroyed is the same reason why she has the fusion suit. The the X kind of went to town on it.
Yeah, and it's like the fact that she gets infected, she doesn't realize it that there's anything wrong, and then all of a sudden she gets sick and crashes her plane into an asteroid or ship into an asteroid. So, how do you feel about all the cosmetic changes between Fusion and Super? And I think this would be an interesting question as well for you, since this is your first-ish foray into the Metroid franchise, given Prime.
I mean, like I know. I mean, like even though Fusion was my first one that I beat, I still knew of the other Metroid games. And honestly, I think the cosmetic changes didn't go far enough, at least below the surface. Considering everything Samus had been through, I was kind of expecting a little bit more disfigurement on her, like at least a scar or something.
I think the weird thing for me is that when they talk about how we tried to get the suit off, but there were complications. It sounded to me like the suit was fused onto her body, but that's not still the case, especially considering that she can still get it off in terms of the ending screens and the general game over animations still retain the same.
Well, I mean, the game over animation is I can see why the game over animation would do that, as it's essentially being ripped off of her.
There's that too. So yeah, for some reason in my head I was like, so she like lives in the suit now, but that's still not quite it.
they made it seem like it was a much more permanent change to her,
Mm-hmm.
and it ended up not being that at all. Like on
Yeah.
top of that, like those ending screens, you know, her appearance has changed so much over the course of just time in general, just in terms of different design choices
Yeah.
made to her, but nothing in terms of showing like any sort of like age or fatigue involved with every mission that she's been on. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen people say that it's probably due to the Chozo DNA and in Fusion case the Metroid DNA.
I mean, that's fair as well, and especially since the start of it, she gets
Yep.
that treatment, and actually that goes segues so good into the question that I just have to move on to it. But the Metroid baby not only saves Samus once by protecting her from Mother Brain and Super Metroid at the end, but then does it again technically with its DNA being placed into Samus's body to save her from the X parasite. How do you feel like this, end caps the baby Metroid's relationship with Samus from its birth in Samus Returns up till now? Considering the fact that, again, like the baby Metroid was found during a mission where Samus kills its entire family,
Yeah.
and then decides to, the one act of mercy throughout all of this is the one baby Metroid that winds up saving her life twice over.
Uh, See, here's the thing. It's probably as much as people don't like it. Other M is canon to this Metroid timeline here,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe it does take place after Super Metroid because they do talk a lot about the baby Metroid.
Yeah, and the
It either takes
PTSD
place.
involved.
It either takes place after. No, it would have to have taken place after
It's
Super because
after
there's
Super,
no.
yeah.
Yeah, because there's no time between 2 and Super, where that would be able to happen because she just goes directly from getting the baby Metroid to delivering it to a Galactic Federation.
Yeah, it's like 15 minutes.
Or however long it takes to drive down to local grocery store in space.
That's right. As I was on my way to the space 7-Eleven, I got a
Yeah,
call, an
I
urgent
had to.
call.
I had to drop my kid off at soccer practice.
Yeah, I think it's kind of it's a weird like bittersweet thing because there's this
Well,
whole the one Metroid she decides to save winds up becoming this big important factor even going into the future of the series.
I mean, yeah, and on top of that, like it's to her benefit that she saved it like in all aspects.
Yeah.
It saved her, like you said, it saved her against Mother Brain. The DNA saved her against the X parasites. I'd love to. I probably should, even though it's a subpar game, it is still canon to the Metroid series. I should probably pick up Other M because that would probably shed a little bit more light on Samus's feelings about
The experience.
yeah, and that's true. Also, that's another one. Everyone forgets about Other M, but it is canon because otherwise, what is it? Because they introduced Adam in Fusion as a
Yeah.
concept, and then they expanded on Adam a lot more during Other M.
Yep.
And boy, he was something. And so yeah, Other M, like it or not, is canon to Metroid, and it's probably worth picking up in some respect in terms of the overall lore. But yeah, in terms of like how Samus feels about the baby Metroid, um, it seemed very business between Return of Samus and Super. Um, because like you see that in that one cutscene, she's just handing over the container with the baby Metroid in and
Mm-hmm.
shaking the hands of the scientists. Um,
Well,
and
and it's
who knows like how the baby Metroid imprinting onto Samus as its mother, affected Samus. I mean, like people who played Other M might know because there's that one line that everybody quotes from Other M, the baby.
the baby.
Yeah, and it's like there probably is a lot going on with Samus psychologically in Other M. Um, but I think there was a lot of dialogue in that, and I think going back to Samus being a mostly silent protagonist, um, is better overall. I think it's better for immersion first off.
Mm-hmm.
And aside from maybe like the like the I'm trying to think now. It's better. I think it's better for overall immersion first off,
Mm-hmm.
because then the player can put themselves on Samus's level. That's the one thing I don't like about a lot of games that try to tell the narrative from the perspective of another character is the fact that it's like, I mean, like there's a market for it, obviously, but like games are an interactive medium. So as the player, I'd like to put myself in that position.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think there's a case for both ways. I've certainly played my fill of RPGs where you play the silent protagonist and others where the entire story is dictated no matter what. And I think part of it is how much of the story do you really want to tell and how much do you want to go from point A to B exactly. Whereas in games where this protagonist is silent, or in Western RPG cases, the dialogue trees that became so prominent in like the late 2000s, with games like Fallout and all that, it gives the player the ability within a certain restrictions to then have their own voice, which could increase the immersion to his perspective. But I get what you're saying, like, and especially with the Metroid series in general, it's a very show don't tell up until Fusion, and that's kind of Prime even kind of goes back to that old, we're not really going to tell you the story through text exposition or monologue. We kind of give it to you through the scanning feature a little bit, but a lot of it is just silent cutscenes.
When you got that scanning feature as well, it's not like you scan something and then it just interrupts you with popping up with whatever it means. You have to go into the menu associated with it. So like that, it only really interrupts gameplay to tell you that you got it. And then you just go right back into gameplay.
Yeah. Or at least at the very, it's like a Pokedex entry in most cases where it's like a couple of sentences. That's cool. Let's move on.
And you can just skip over it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Prime 1 did that really well. Prime 2 did that all right. And Prime 3 was a dialogue heavy mess.
Yeah. And I think, whether or not that works to its detriment or not from the series as a whole, because I feel like, not to talk too much about Dread, but I feel like Dread does a little bit of both. And we'll kind of talk more about how Fusion does it in a little bit and how that kind of plays into the game's linearity. But going back to that theme of loneliness and dread, which I think is a good point, as you say, like Samus is mostly a silent protagonist, and how does that not only get you immersed as a player, but how does that increase that feeling of loneliness because there's really nobody to talk to. So going back to that theme of loneliness and dread, Metroid introduces actually a new villain called SAX in this case, who, as we mentioned before, persistently chases the player at certain moments. How do you feel like that increases that tension and that fear for the player?
Well, there's definitely there's always the panic from it of trying to either sneak by, well, just trying to sneak by SAX in general, or just trying to rush through it and let SAX see you. But there's it's a two-pronged attack because you have that tense moment of, is SAX going to see me? What's going to happen when SAX sees me? Like, am I going to get a game over? And it really like plays into that just like the fear. And when SAX is searching for you, she walks slow. Like she walks very slow and intimidatingly. And like, and one of the times where you first see her, you don't even really know that it's her, because the first thing you see is the beam of light coming off the visor to try and look for you. And then she just walks on there. But the second you're visible to SAX, the chase is on completely. She's got all your powers from Super Metroid, minus the gravity suit. But like, and she's just like blasted you with the ice beam, and you just gotta book it out of there. So there's the tension, and then there's the adrenaline packed fear. So it really does that well in a two-pronged attack, where during those suspenseful moments where you're trying to sneak, like you're trying to like be like, okay, don't, like, please don't turn around, like what's happening here, like what's she gonna do, is she gonna see me, yada yada yada, and then in an instant it goes bam right into that adrenaline filled fear where you're like, I gotta get out of here, I can't fight this thing, I don't have the power to right now, and just running.
Yeah, book it.
So Fusion does a really good job in creating that fear. I think also it does a good, not necessarily with just with SAX, but I feel like in terms of, I guess, shock factor, in a sense, just in terms of disturbing content, specifically with the boss Nightmare. With Nightmare, it doesn't even look that bad of a villain. It looks a little bit disturbing at face value because it's got like something covering up its face. you knock that cover off, and it's like this goopy mess of a face. And the more you damage it, the more it droops, and it's just it's a very disturbing boss. And that also can play into a bit of fear as well, considering the ability that Nightmare has to increase gravity, so your missiles can't reach it. And its movement patterns can be very difficult to try to avoid.
Well, that it's another thing to think about, that the main villain or the main enemy types in the game are kind of par for the course for a Metroid title, but the bosses themselves are very grotesque looking, which is it's weird to say that as a differentiator, because Super Metroid, one could argue, like, Kraid, it looks ugly, but there's just this like very extreme type of ugly that Metroid Fusion kind of employs with a lot of its boss graphics.
I feel like in at least with Nightmare, it's body horror.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like other, even then, like I'm thinking of other bosses or other larger enemies that are a little bit more cartoonishly detailed, and almost seem kind of out of touch of what the rest of the game kind of looks like.
Yeah.
So, and again, my memory is probably just about as good as yours, because I haven't played Fusion in a long time either. But I do remember the look and feel of Fusion in general is very different in terms of some of the enemy types that like kind of look more on this, like, I think they show a lot more dripping, like you were talking about with the face, but in even other boss characters, there's just more drips that the bosses have.
X Ridley. When you find the corpse of the frozen corpse of Ridley, and then that gets taken over by an X parasite. That's that one like, because that just becomes like a very grotesque looking Ridley. So like you have no idea what you're coming across with that one. And they didn't really do much of that in Dread.
No.
Either. I get
minus one or two examples, but I feel like with Dread, a lot of the bosses are clean.
Yeah.
So, and that's the best way I can
even
describe
so,
it.
Like, the other thing too is that like with Fusion, and it is a spoiler to talk about that in terms of it's so hard because like I'm trying to like determine it, but I'm trying to also bring it back to the comparison to Fusion.
Yeah, I know. I think I have an idea of what you're talking about.
I mean, in the beginning of you see one at the beginning of the game, like in the opening cutscene
of Dread.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of that, but I'm lost. But I'm thinking of way late.
I'm talking about the X parasites.
Oh, the X parasites. Okay.
Yeah, because
that's not really a spoiler.
Okay,
I'll give you
because
that.
when the X parasites like I mean the X parasites do weird things where they just absorb creatures just coming out of the woodwork and then like turning into other creatures. But there isn't really much of like that. Actually, there kind of is.
There isn't a way.
There is like some of that grotesque body horror for some of them. It doesn't necessarily have to be goopy. It just has to kind of be like mutated in a sense. Yeah. And some of them do that, but it's a lot cleaner than it was in Fusion. I feel comparing the enemies in Fusion, which the entire game takes place in what is essentially a nature preserve filled with Zabishian enemies from the planet Zebes that blew up in Super Metroid. And comparing the ones from Fusion to the ones from Super, the Fusion ones look a lot more grotesque because of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking about.
The other thing as well. The same with every Game Boy Advance game is that the gamma on like the default gamma on every Game Boy Advance game is like very like white and washed out because the original Game Boy Advance didn't have a backlight to its screen. So that kind of messed with the atmosphere a little bit when playing it on like a modern console. But it still does a fairly good job at setting the tone, even with that like bright, like muted, washed out kind of look.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also a stark contrast of looking at all these grotesque, drippy things, and the fact that you're kind of in like you said, a nature preserve. It's this entire man-made structure that is very scientific. It's
very sterile.
It's sterile. Yeah, is a good way to put it. Like each area has their own look and feel, but on top of that, that this is like a man-made, quote unquote, like clean, one could say,
Yeah.
preserve. So like seeing those boss enemies is just like a very stark contrast. So on top of that, on top of all of that, do you feel like SAX creates a new sensation of fear that wasn't present in the franchise before?
Oh,
Um,
definitely.
I feel like with SAX, you've never had something. You've always had something that was stronger than you, but you never had it on your back constantly.
Well, the other thing too is that in every other Metroid game, every enemy in some way, shape, or form, if you, for the most part, like barring what do you call it? Sequence breaking. If you
Mm-hmm.
could find an enemy in any Metroid game before Fusion, you could defeat it. SAX you couldn't defeat until a certain point in the story.
That's true. It kind of goes into the game's linearity in a way, which is also a great segue into our next topic. But yeah, I think the other thing you mentioned too is like SAX has everything that you used to have.
Yep.
It is another thing entirely, the fact that not only is Samus starting over, but she's weaker than she was the last time she technically started over.
Yeah.
Like she
Because of
has,
her Metroid DNA, she's now weak to cold.
she's weak to cold. She doesn't have the armor she used to have. She actually takes far more damage in this game at the start of it than she used to.
Infusion.
Yeah, within Fusion specifically. So, Samus is at this point not the same person that she was before, not just physically, but also in terms of gameplay, choice, and
Yep.
design. Which I think also plays into the fact that she can, wall hang in Fusion. Like that was an introduction to that mechanic. They also let go of the fact that you can't wall jump back onto the wall you wall jumped from, which kind of gets rid of a lot of
Oh,
that
and
sequence
Fusion.
breaking.
Yeah, yeah,
In
yeah.
Fusion. So it's very interesting, some of the gameplay differences and how that can also kind of evoke a different sense of fear, because you're just not who you used to be.
Yep.
Um,
That's makes that's a that feeling is much more powerful going from Super to Fusion as
mhm,
opposed to just like picking up Fusion like either as your first Metroid game or playing it like way after you played Super.
yeah.
Um I think I feel like I want to say that Prime probably did it the best in my opinion in terms of in terms of like losing power, because at the beginning of the game you have like all the power that Samus has.
Yeah.
You have the Varia suit. I think yeah.
You have
What is it?
grappling.
You,
I think you
I don't know if you have grappling. No, you do because
you do.
you need to escape. Okay, so yeah, you've got the Varia suit, you've got grappling, you've got the charge beam, you've got the morph ball. You may have bombs. I don't remember,
I think you have bombs.
but it gives you a taste of like of the power that you'll have throughout the game, but you have to earn it back.
Yeah, and it's the only, I think it's the first Metroid that actually explains like you don't have what you used to.
Yeah,
Metroid, you get the Varia suit, you get the gravity suit, and then for whatever reason, I mean, Zero
you
Mission
just don't
explains it a
have it.
little bit better, but yeah, in Metroid 2, you just don't have it. Metroid 2, you
Yeah,
get the Varia suit, you get
gravity
all
suit, and
the
then
different, and then you just don't have it anymore.
so I mean, like, Return of Samus, or yeah, the original Game Boy version that probably doesn't explain where all that power went, but
Nope,
presumably Samus Returns would the
uh,
3DS remake. I mean, like,
I don't think so.
then that's weird. Then it might be the kind of thing where we'll have to see on terms of a. That's a little. I mean, here, well, my reasoning for that is just in terms of continuity, and like it's a Metroid game. Who really cares?
Yeah,
But just like in terms of like of them trying to create this new continuity with these remakes, or rather like flesh out the continuity, not really like rewrite history. Um, but they did that in Zero Mission by stripping Samus of the power suit, and that's where we got the Zero suit from.
hmm,
Um, and you think they would do the same thing in the 3DS remake of Return of Samus, um, just because there is that like there's such a small amount of time between the end of Metroid 2 and the beginning of Super Metroid.
Yeah. I mean, again, there's added content there as well, but I could be wrong. But I specifically remember you just kind of walk away with all your power ups. You don't like
Yeah.
lose it at the end, and you show up with nothing. So
Super, you end up with all your power ups at the end, but they explain why you don't have them at the beginning of Fusion.
exactly. For some reason, as a kid, I always likened it to something like she put all of it away. Like she has like a closet and she just put everything away. And then she, because everything was so haphazard, she had to come back. I mean, she comes back with the baby Metroid, and it looks like in Super Metroid, it looks like she comes back with her regular suit, not with any of the power ups.
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, like even Dread is a little bit. Even though you lose your powers in that, you enter that area with the Varia suit, not the gravity suit.
Gravity suit. And it would be one thing if the gravity suit was always optional, but it never is.
Yeah.
Or at least, in typical gameplay.
I don't mean to derail this too much, but I was watching a speedrunner play through Metroid Dread, and they were looking at a trick to get I think it's the screw attack like super early. Like when I say super early, I mean when you first get the counter tutorial early.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But the problem is it's 4 minutes of blind exploring on a on the screen where you do the counter tutorial. And that basically just ruined any percent, because the first time that gets that, now the only good times have to spend 4 minutes trying to navigate through this blind in order to be able to do this. So it's just like just interesting from seeing that, where it's like now like any percent has more or less been ruined by this trick, at least for now, until a better one can come later. But basically how it works is that like the camera locks in on where you do the counter tutorial.
Yeah.
And so it unloads all the doors in the area. So like you're able to just like to just like keep going throughout areas that you normally wouldn't be able to go through.
Wow.
Because I guess they're counted as like scene transition actors, and because the camera's locked, it thinks it doesn't need that anymore, so it disables them. And then at some point you just go through doors you're not supposed to, and you end up at the screw attack. But yeah, the speedrunner I was watching is like one of the top speedrunners. I think it was Oats and Goats, was saying like, yeah, any percent is dead once somebody gets a time with this, just because of how boring it's going to be to watch somebody try to navigate through this.
Oh, okay. Because it is, since the camera's fixed, you just have to like try.
Like boring to watch, and also very hard and technical to get through. That I mean, like I'm getting off rails here from Metroid, but that's just when speedruns die, is when something is when a strategy is found that's either dependent on blind luck or like intense memorization, hoping to God that you're getting it right, because you don't have any visual cue whatsoever.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's fair. I wouldn't want to try and deal with that.
Yeah, I mean that's what a lot of people said about Ocarina of Time for a while, when it was like a skip where basically you have to, like, a rock has to hit you very specifically in order for you to gain backwards momentum or something like that.
Okay.
And it's completely RNG where that rock will spawn, and if it even gives you that backwards momentum.
Okay, so it's just a bunch of just sitting around waiting and hoping that that's the one.
At least in terms of Ocarina of Time, like, and that was also that the record time for that was also so low that like it was hard to just even attempt doing that.
Right? Isn't that specifically like? Okay, yeah, I get you.
The 80% run before they found the credits were pretty much.
Oh, okay, got it. So going further away from that, because like Metroid and part of speedrunning is all about being able to break linearity, and it's really helpful with games that don't have a lot of linearity or a lot of lockdowns. Metroid Fusion kind of goes back on this a lot, surprisingly.
Yeah.
It appears to be a much more linear than the previous game. Samus is constantly given orders and is told pretty much exactly where to go.
Yep.
But unlike Zero Mission, where the game tells you where to go or where you can go next, that's the difference. It tells you where you can go next. And so Adam is basically saying, go here in order to progress. If you want to keep going, you have to go right here. So beyond the story, beyond because Samus needs more help because she's not the same way she used to be. But beyond that, why do you think that the game changed and went back to this linear style?
I think it's because of the accessibility of gaming. Uh, Newer, like in the early 2000s, it, gaming was kind of evolving from a niche hobby into an actual sort of like multimedia, like you know competitive, competitive market to movies in terms of an entertainment experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so having having it the player's actions be driven by um being told where to go plays into more people being able to play it, as opposed to like people. I mean, like, here's the thing: a lot of people that don't play games think that games that don't have story. This was more true like way back in the day, but like people who don't play games would think that games that didn't have any sort of like narrative story to it were stupid, because it was just you kind of going around and trying to get to the
Mm-hmm.
end of something that didn't really make sense. But like, at least to them anyway. But as a player, you see the inherent worth of that. You see the inherent worth of going around getting these power ups, and then overcoming those challenges. It's
Mm-hmm.
less of a narrative experience in that regard, and more of like a challenge. But in terms of accessibility, it's better to have more of a narrative feel to it, because that can kind of guide the player's actions when they don't when somebody who hasn't played games before would get impatient
Yeah.
um with just like wandering around trying to figure out if A works with B, which was a big issue with games back in the day, because you kind of had, for the most part, with games that were as open as Metroid, and to a lesser extent Castlevania too, but that has problems for a different reason.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, in games like that, like a lot of the way that games worked back then, just because of the lack of internet, was just like bashing your head against the wall in certain areas and hoping that wall would crack. And then if that didn't work, like talking to your friends that knew about that stuff, they were able to either figure it out or call the Nintendo hotline,
Yep.
or had a strategy guide, or
Nintendo
had a
Power.
subscription to Nintendo Power. Yep, with all the tips, and like they would be able to pass on that information to you, uh, or you pass it on to other players, and that's how a lot of it was spread. Like a lot of those games, uh, nowadays I kind of call that the water cooler game,
Yeah.
where like and in today's standard, it's a lot more prevalent in those massive open world games like Skyrim, or the Elder Scrolls, the really only one that comes to mind. But like Fallout and the Elder Scrolls are good examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
Every person's playthrough in the first like 5 hours is going to be vastly different from anybody else's. And especially in those kind of RPGs where the overall where not only is the world gigantic and there's a lot of stuff to do in it, but you as the player have control over how you grow.
Yeah.
At least in that regard, you pick what skills you want. You decide which skills to level up. You could do that, and like you could do all of that, and then there are guides online for that. But the real like community that comes from those big open world games comes from people talking about their different experiences of it in the first like few hours of playing it.
Yeah.
And that's generally what those old games were like, because there weren't those guides. You had to have lines of communication with other people in some regard, even if that line was so far as removed as, say, like a magazine or a hotline. um but you had to have those communications if you wanted to progress, and not just have to keep experimenting with what would work in the game. um and so like and so in terms of Metroid, because people mostly and because like a lot of the casual audience back then wanted the narrative to be able to talk about with people, as opposed to the overall gameplay. That's why it would push in that direction, just to give casual people the direction to go, and the ability to finish the story, so that way they wouldn't be left out of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think like it's a really big point that you just made. I've kind of made the same utterances in terms of like, this game is a water cooler game. I think the original Legend of Zelda is such a big example of that because you don't know. There are so many things about the original Legend of Zelda that you just don't know unless you are told. So many different holes in the wall, so many different things to bomb, and you wouldn't even think to do it. And there are still games like that today. But I think even back in Metroid's case, or a game like Dragon Quest, the original, not only was it so that you didn't know where to go, but you would be punished for not going the right way. You could go anywhere you want, but unless you're good, and in some JRPGs cases, that didn't even matter, you would just get completely crushed if you went the wrong way. So I think in certain parts, like, that does help a brand new Metroid player who hasn't played the games within that 8-year time gap, to kind of get more intimate with the franchise. I think also, to go on top of all that, I think the fact that it is on a handheld system, because Metroid 2 isn't linear in the same way. It doesn't tell you exactly where to go, but it keeps you from progressing until you've done a certain amount of something. And in that case, it's defeat a certain number of Metroids, and then the acid lowers and you can go further on down into the planet. But it's not, structure. It doesn't lock you into anything the way that Fusion does. And I think part of that probably plays into, it is a simple Game Boy Advance game, and there are a lot, like, I think there was a video I was watching on the Geek Critique, it's hard to say, where they talk about the game. It's no accident that there are so many save points littered within the space station, and that there's always one at the very start of each space, area of the station you go to. Like, that's intentional by design, because you need to save, because if your battery dies after like 8 hours, you got to go find a place to save. But I think a lot of that kind of also plays in on top of that accessibility. I think this is right before Nintendo kind of got to that very hand-holdy place that a lot of people kind of chastised them for in the GameCube, Wii, DS era.
It was 2 years before the DS, which is, I think, is the top selling console of all time. Don't quote me on that, because I think one of the more recent generations. It was really up there, and it's really struck a chord with casual gamers. And there's so much casual software for DS games nowadays. I mean, like, just throughout its entire life cycle. And then it was 4 years away from the Wii, which was, the DS's marketability towards the casual brought to a home console that everybody can enjoy at the same time. So they were kind of moving in that direction anyway, with sort of like that hand-holding sense. But to touch on another note as well, for that, I think accessibility was one of the reasons, but the other reason as well is they were still experimenting. With how to make the formula work for a modern audience. Because if you think about it, there have only they had 4 shots at it through Fusion. The first Metroid, they didn't know what they were doing really at all, because that style of game was just so new. I'm trying to remember if Kid Icarus came out before Metroid, but they played very similarly. I actually think that
they
one
were
of them was
about the same time, actually.
Yeah, one of them was produced on the other's engine. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, though. But they played very similarly. So it would suffice to say that whatever mistakes they made on one of those, they would have corrected in the other. And then Return of Samus was a Game Boy game, so like they had to. So not only were they trying to like correct their mistakes from the original Metroid, but also do it on vastly inferior hardware. And with probably not that much room to make improvements for overall like accessibility or like gameplay and whatnot. And then Super Metroid, they took what they learned from the first 2 Metroid games and vastly improved on it. But it was also so open that, and gaming was still such a niche market at that point, that nobody that only people who really played video games were able to get into Super Metroid. So I think by the time, the 8 years later, by the time that the Game Boy took off and gaming became much more of a commercial success across like all markets, they needed to, they felt that the way of the future was to make it more accessible for a broader appeal.
Hmm.
And then and that's probably and that relates back to the reason why it's more of a linear experience than other Metroid games.
Yeah, I think I won't. I try not to harp a little bit too or harp. I try not to talk a little bit too much about what I'm about to say. There's actually an episode I would love to do, and just a topic on games and difficulty and how we interact with that as players of a medium. But one of the things I think we often forget or just didn't know, depending on the age range, but not only did Super Metroid, its advertisement was saying this game will beat you up. Like, this game is hard and it will, they bring in it. The whole commercial is a scientist bringing in like I think it's like a Doberman, and they bring the Doberman in to like battle Super Metroid. And then I think the dog, after they show gameplay footage and how extreme and awesome the game is,
It's like Doberman like running away with its tail between its legs.
it like shrinks or something like that. I think
Yeah,
it
yeah.
either shrinks down or it becomes like a poodle or something like that. So they intentionally were trying to tell the player, like, this is the kind of game that is a challenge.
90s marketing for Nintendo games was really weird because that was also the time when Earthbound was coming out, and their marketing
Yeah.
strategy for that was this game
This game
stinks. Yeah.
I think other than that example, I honestly kind of miss like the advertising that Nintendo used to do with like the Play It Loud campaign.
I mean, like, there's also been legislation that's because of the way those were advertised, it was
Yeah.
like very much targeted towards kids. So
Yeah.
legislation has made it a lot harder to pull off those kinds of commercials. Now, a lot of the times when you see ads for video games, it's mostly just like gameplay and a very safe narrator voice saying like why it's good to play this game. Good for
Yeah.
the family. It'll provide you with a challenge, that kind of thing.
Serena Williams loves it.
Exactly. They'll get like
Celebrity
celebrities.
endorsement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Sony does some fantastical stuff with their advertisements. I kind of wish that Nintendo would just like loosen the tie a little bit.
But
their ads.
the thing with Sony's really, like, with say like Sony's or Microsoft, most of their content isn't geared toward families.
That's true too.
It's geared towards like the teenage to young adult demographic,
Capital G
which
gamers.
which they can get away with more in terms of like that sort of targeted advertising. Whereas with family oriented stuff, things that children are going to play, you can't due to like laws. Kappa is pretty much the reason behind that. That's
Remember Kappa.
I mean, it's still a thing. It's been a thing since '98.
Yeah,
it's been a thing since '98.
Yes, that's true too.
But Kappa's whole the whole thing with Kappa is just like is that whole thing about targeted advertising towards kids. And I think, and here's the thing, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. I'm a YouTuber. I don't like the fact that if something on my channel is marketed toward kids, and I don't get paid as much. But I also understand it where it's in the sense where it's like I could just like advertise something to a kid.
And there have been examples
using like flowery language to appeal to them on subjects that don't necessarily have a right or wrong answer and sway their influence.
Yeah.
And that's what Kappa is really for.
Yeah, and I mean some of the ads that YouTubers are able to kind of do in terms of their partnerships, it's kind of like I wouldn't want an 8-year-old to be drinking a ton of G Fuel,
Right.
But yeah, more on that. And then the last point I really wanted to make was like, I think with video games in general, in the arcade days, the whole point was to die so that you would have to keep spending money in order to keep playing it.
Yep,
and
quarter
so
eaters.
When you go into the console space, there's still that mindset of this game has to be hard so that especially a 20-minute game can be strengthened or lengthened up to, 5 or 6 hours. So having to go from that to games that are now longer and don't have to be short and don't have to be hard was a very weird thing for Nintendo to try and figure out. And I think they kind of like overcorrected in one era and now they're trying to kind of meet somewhere in the middle.
The other thing too is that transition from the arcade to home console really did bring its own challenge. How do you make, like, and let's just go with modern day pricing here. How do you make something that costs $60, last enough time to feel like it's worth it?
Well, and even
And
then, it's
and
like
like but in terms of the arcade space, it was the fact that like you wanted to get the high score, you wanted to progress further, you wanted to see if you could do this and
practice
beat
at
this
home
challenge.
too.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, like that's for the arcade space. In terms of the home console, the only way to really get that to work, just because of how small the games are, like most games from that era, if you're good at them, can be beaten in like
Yeah,
as short as like 1 hour and as long as like maybe like 6. So like barring like a JRPG or something like that.
hmm
So the way they do that was that they had to artificially up the difficulty. You know, kids definitely wouldn't be able to beat it, but these were advertised as toys. So they kind of had to like, they really had to like sort of knock you down and like sort of make you learn how to really like progress through the game, in order to get through. And if everything was like easy and handholdy through that, then games would be over in such a short time that it wouldn't be worth that price tag.
yeah, I agree. And I would love to talk more about it, but I'm just gonna take some notes after this episode, and we'll get back on that. Yeah, it's games difficulty and how companies kind of deal with that, and how we as players interact with that on a social and just gameplay scale is really interesting, to me at least. So, and especially with the history of video games behind it, it's a very difficult concept, I think, to just come to a specific terms or specific agreement on what is or isn't difficult.
You could probably divide video game history, not based off like console generations or things like that,
But
but
by
based off.
difficulty,
Yeah, probably based off of
yeah,
like difficulty. Like this is the arcade era. This is, like the blockbuster rental era where
yeah,
they didn't want you to be able to beat a game in
good
the
old
time that
Lion
you were
King,
renting it for Blockbuster.
yeah.
And then like moving on from there is like this is the casual era. And then we're probably like still in sort of like a casual. I'm trying to think. We're definitely in a more like cinematic era than I'd say casual, because I feel
hmm
like more people have jumped onto video games now, so there can be that sense of challenge again, and it doesn't have to be as handholdy as it was before.
Well, and on top of that,
Um,
I think like hard games are now they're being brought back into the spotlight as buy this, it's hard. Like that's a selling point for the game.
I feel like Dark Souls really pushed that.
Yeah,
Demon Souls and Dark Souls really pushed that, mainly due to um, the fact that with yeah, and that really was sort of like the end, the not really the tail end, but kind of edging into that sort of like that tapering off of like the casual era, where more people were like, because casual brought in the audience, and then yeah, casual gaming brought in a massive audience, and at some point that casual audience started learning how to play
how to
games
play
better.
games. Yeah,
Yeah, and so like it's like, oh, these games are getting boring, and then Demon Souls came along and Dark Souls comes along, and that's why and I hate this comparison so much, just because it's like the comparison nowadays, at least like maybe like 5 years ago or something like that, was like that every hard game was the Demon Souls of blank.
yeah.
Cuphead was the Demon Souls of
2D,
platformers.
yeah, of Gunstar Heroes.
Yeah.
Um,
But
yeah,
but you never hear about those older games that brought about those older games that were like harder than Dark Souls even. And it's just because that in that in that's because like in that sort of like that sort of like sphere there, of people really getting into games was during that era when casual gaming was on the rise. So of course the first thing you're going to think of when they think of difficulty is Dark Souls, not Ninja Gaiden or
Fester's
Silver
Quest.
Surfer or yeah, or
Yeah,
Simon's Quest
or games that were just like, well, Fester's Quest, but like even
or
games
Fester's
that were
Quest.
just
Sorry.
bad due to its design, like the fact that we have games that are just kind of made poorly with bad hit detection back then. Like Battletoads isn't really a game that's hard once you've memorized it. It's
Yep.
just a game of memorization, and once you've done it enough, you can pretty much go through it. But What's the
We've
Battletoads of video games? Like
we've gotten we've gotten a bit off track off
a
Metroid, but
little
one more
bit.
note I want to one more note I want to make in
No,
terms
you're
of
good.
like
You're good.
something like that is like learning the controls and memorization. That's how pretty much everyone learns to play video games starting off.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like the one game that I honestly defend to the very end in terms of most of its criticism, there's still a lot of blemishes on it, is Star Fox Zero. That game did not have bad controls. You just had to learn them.
And I think, and just to get on that, I I spent enough time with Star Fox Zero to go, okay, I don't like this control scheme, but I like this one. And what a lot of people I don't think kind of got at some point was you could alter the gameplay experience just enough that I was like, okay, I can do this. I can't do this one, but I can do like a combination of these things. So I got it to work for me. And with enough time, you just start to learn it and you get better at it. And I think we don't give ourselves that time anymore. Like the game just has to work from the get go, I think.
Yep.
And that's another thing, and I'll bring it back to Metroid. I'm gonna do it. Just watch me. With Dread, I think what some people were kind of saying with Dread was like, "Hey, I don't remember like Metroid games being this hard. I feel like Dread is harder than the previous Metroid games." And one of the things that I thought for a minute was, is it that the game is hard? Sure, but so was Super Metroid when I first played it.
Yeah, like how often did you play that? You're comparing a brand new game that you've never experienced before to something that maybe you've put like dozens to hundreds of hours in.
Exactly. And it's sort of like, is it hard or is it just that the game is telling you that you have to learn it?
Yep.
And even with tutorials on how to use different button combinations or presses, you still have to learn how to do it. You have to learn the timing of the enemy attacks in order to counterattack them. They're not supposed to be easy the first time you play it. And if you just are intuitive enough and you get it pretty quickly, that's fantastic. But for other people, it's going to take a little bit more time, and that's the point. Um, and so I feel like with Dread or with certain games in general, we kind of like, is this game hard? Or is it just not so easy that I get it immediately upon playing it? Is Sekiro hard, or I just need to learn how to play it? In most games, they don't really need you to learn how to play it.
It's
Um,
like watching somebody play an instrument and then trying to learn it yourself and being like, "Nope, this is too hard. I give up."
well, it's even like, okay, I learned how to play a brass instrument. Cool. Now I'm going to learn how to play the violin.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like
I wouldn't go that far with it. I'd say it's still like within the same category. Like
maybe
I learned how to.
woodwind.
I learned how to, like, for example, like let's say like I learned how to play the trombone. Now I could definitely know how to play the trumpet. Well, you got like the finger valves first
Yeah.
off, and like your lips have to go in a different way because it's a tighter mouthpiece. It's very similar to that. I wouldn't say it's as removed as saying going from like trombone to violin,
Maybe
but it's still
saxophone.
I'd say it's still removed as saying staying with the same category of instrument,
Yeah.
just a different instrument.
Yeah. I mean, there's things that you just have to learn, and I think the honest to goodness thing was that I was seeing was people were saying like, "Here's my time," but I felt like I could have done better. It was just that the game was hard, and it's like, and their time is like maybe 7 hours, and it's like that's
Yeah, it's like you,
respectable.
it's you beat the time requirement for getting one of the secret screenshots at the end that like all Metroid games are kind of known for.
Yeah, so cut yourself some slack.
Yeah.
So brought it back to Metroid. So do you think that? And another thing that the Fusion does is there's a very big overarching story, but there are smaller missions that you have to do, and you report back to Adam. He tells you to go somewhere else. Do you think that having that with smaller missions, having Samus complete smaller missions, winds up being more helpful to the player overall as a result?
So, kind of relating back to the uh casual gaming experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think that those like smaller missions strewn into the overarching mission is really good to teach casual players like how to play the game, get through these different challenges and whatnot, prepare them for what's ahead. It's like high school to college, pretty much.
Mm.
Um, However, in terms of an overall narrative for a linear game, I don't think it's good game design to tell the player what to do. If it is a linear game, the player should not be told what to do because they're going to find it anyway.
Yeah. I think in
I
Metroid's case is a little different just from going to left to right, but I'm thinking of like Donkey Kong Country. They don't really tell
True.
you need to go to a certain place, but you kind of get where you're supposed to go.
Yeah. But I think in terms of like of Metroid Fusion though, and like I think Dread does a really good job of this. That I think probably could have been implemented a little bit better in Fusion, but again, trying to appeal to the casual market probably on that one a little bit more. I wouldn't say probably try to appeal to the casual market. I do feel like there might have been a very niche market for Fusion overall, just because of like there were some pretty hefty difficulty spikes if you didn't know what you were doing. But the one thing that Dread does really well is that you'll be playing through the game and you'll notice things that you can't do yet. And then you'll get that power up and you'll be like, great, I'm heading through this way anyway. I can get through that. Oh, look, here's progress in the story. And you weren't told exactly where to go. I think the Atom sections in Dread are vastly improved from the Atom sections in Fusion, where the AI would pop up and have a glowing point on your map telling you exactly where to go. Whereas in Dread, it's like, this is the general area that you need to go. But I have no idea how you're supposed to get through there, so you're gonna have to figure it out on your own. I think that's vastly improved in terms of the overall gameplay experience.
And that's a good point that you make that I didn't think about, where, Adam basically says, hey, you can't do this one thing over this one area, so you might need like this, that, and the other thing. So you should go get those before you try to keep going.
Yep. But it's not even like you should go get those. Here's where they are. It's just you should go get those.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it.
And Sam's just like, all right.
And I think that's all you need. I think with Metroid Fusion, it might have been a little bit difficult to communicate that just because of the overall graphical quality and the size of the size of the screen you'd originally be playing it on.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of in the air whether or not the Atom sections in Fusion were necessary. To just in order for them to tell you exactly where to go, but
I think the only thing
it's done a lot better in Dread.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can think about in terms of Fusion and the way that it does it is that it's really helpful from a perspective of I just put the game away for like 2 weeks and now I'm coming back to it. But I think like that's it, and that's helpful, and I like games that do that. But I think with Dread, there had been moments where I'd put it away for a couple of days, but I think what Dread kind of does is that it's like that line from Futurama where it's like, if you've done everything perfectly right, then they won't know you've done anything at all. It's like the one where Bender becomes a god.
I know, but I'm trying to figure out
it's not the exact quote, but
yeah, I'm just trying to figure out like where you're going with this.
So where I'm going with this is that there are certain things and there are moments in the game where they're kind of like, you can't get that. I don't know what that block is, but you definitely can't destroy it with everything you have now. And so you just kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to go where this open path is, and I'm going to go where it's clearly obvious that I can go. And then eventually you do find that thing. Sometimes at some points it's very late, but the game kind of naturally gives you a line from point A to B without directly telling you that it's there. And then you go and then you defeat something, and then you find out that that's actually where you were supposed to go the whole time. And then you find a power-up, and in some cases, that thing that you couldn't get or that thing you couldn't bypass, it's right there in the next room afterwards. In other cases, if it's like in a completely different area of the game, how convenient. Look, a transporter right here that brings you right to this one area that you just couldn't get through, and then you come back and you're like, oh my god, that's the thing. Like, you don't even have to remember and backtrack the way you did in previous games. You just kind of like are led to these areas, and it's not telling you to do any of that. It's just kind of naturally letting you do it on your own.
It's well designed through it guides you through exploration. You like, as the player, you want to be looking for everything.
Yeah.
and there may only be like one path in certain sections. Later, that's not necessarily the case, but in some sections, it's like in earlier sections, it's like, well, I can't go this way. I guess I'll explore somewhere else.
Yeah.
And like, and it rewards, and it greatly rewards that knack for exploration with a feeling of progress. And like, I'm trying to think of the word for it, because what's coming to my mind is manipulative, which it is, but in a positive sense.
It makes you feel like you figured it out on your own, and it gives that like endorphin rush of like, oh, now I can do this, and it's right here. Like all of these things that the game is kind of being like, you need to go here now, and if this were Fusion, or if this were even Zero Mission, you get an upgrade, and then the game would pause and it would tell you, here's where the next upgrade is. It doesn't necessarily tell you have to go there, but here's like the almost linear progression of Zero Mission.
Yeah.
That tells you to go here and here and here.
In Dungeons and Dragons, the term for when like a game master is kind of like pushing a story along in a specific direction and like more or less obviously doing it is called railroading.
Yeah.
But it's technically, but it's really not railroading if it's subtle enough, which is what Metroid Dread does really well.
It's like an escape room where the dungeon master is kind of like, instead of telling you need to go check the drawer, maybe like there's a color of the drawer that just kind of shines a little bit more than the other drawers, and you kind of notice it. It helps you as the player feel smart, or like, I did this, when the people designing it were like, I kind of helped you do this,
right?
Without saying it.
Kind of like if, let's say, like that drawer didn't really have anything special on it, but like you're checking everything and you go to open that drawer and it's locked. It's like, well, that drawer definitely needs something, so let's try to find out what that drawer needs.
Yeah, and then the key for it or whatever is probably somewhere that's a little bit easier to get to.
And I guess like another comparison for this is, the mission in Breath of the Wild where you're secretly escorting the Korok to the shrine?
Yes. I had to think about that for a minute.
It's a really annoying one. Yeah. The reason it comes to mind is because it sticks out so much just because of how annoying it is.
Yes.
I feel like the way Metroid Dread does that is like sort of like the design of the game is like Link, and you're the Korok, but instead of Link defeating all the enemies, the Korok knows how to use the bow, knows how to use like a bow or a sword, and Link's off to the side, like just kind of waiting in case things get really bad.
Yeah, or like he's just, all of a sudden he just kind of like throws a sword out into the path of the Korok, and the Korok's like, oh wow, look, a sword just for me. Yeah.
I mean, maybe not that obvious, but just in something where it's like trying to like maybe edging the Korok in a way to finding a piece of equipment that'd be useful for taking on the enemies that are inevitably there.
Exactly. And thinking about linear gameplay, do you think that more linear gameplay aspect makes Fusion less difficult than previous games, or do you actually think it allows the game to be more difficult as a result?
I think it could have allowed the game to be more difficult, but then again, I'm still of the mind. I mean, I can't say that it's I keep going back to the phrase casual gaming, and let me just state something very clearly. Metroid Fusion is not a casual gaming. I think it was just trying to appeal more to casual gamers with the way it was designed. But I think a lot of the difficulty in older Metroid games came from just kind of being lost and trying to figure out where exactly to go.
Ambiguity.
Yeah. You'd waste a lot of time trying to like either muscle your way through a puzzle that just wasn't happening, or just like getting lost trying to figure out like where exactly you need to go. And like one thing that Dread brought back, which if Dread is a first time experience for somebody, I think this might have been a misstep in terms of design. In Super Metroid, in the one of the pathways you can get to Meridia was you would travel through a glass tube that would lead you to a glass tube that was like underwater, and you could break that with the power bomb. It's not obvious that you could break it with the power bomb,
not at all,
because I think Super Nintendo Metroid was still kind of living in the Nintendo Hotline era. But they brought that back in Dread with no indication that you could use the power bomb to destroy that. I think that's a misstep in terms of new players.
I
in
think
terms of
yeah,
them trying to attract new players.
because even
Is
as a
putting in something
veteran,
it's something putting something in specifically for nostalgic
yeah.
players. Not even the radar that could tell where like certain blocks are wouldn't help you with that. And you need to blow that up to advance.
There's only one thing that I can think about in terms of that, but I don't want to talk too much about it.
Is it
Because
spoilers?
a little bit.
Okay.
So yeah, it's the only saving grace for it is spoiler related. So there is that. And then yeah, Mercury Steam does one thing in both Metroid games that is a little annoying. And I guess what I'll say that doesn't spoil it is you can't 100% it until you get the very last upgrade. Like both Samus Returns and Metroid Dread, just keep playing through the game as much as you can and find stuff as it comes along. But don't worry about 100%ing it until you've gotten everything.
The last
Yeah.
upgrade that you're supposed to get.
Exactly. And I think Super doesn't necessarily quite do that in the same way, or other Metroid games don't necessarily quite do that. But also other Metroid games have intense sequence breaking, so if you could do that in Dread, then Bob's your uncle. I think the only thing
the other thing too is that in terms of Metroid Dread, older Metroid games had bonuses for depending on how fast you beat it and 100%ing in it.
Yeah.
Dread doesn't have that. Dread just has I mean, there are rewards for 100%ing the game, but not in tandem with doing the speedrun challenges.
Okay, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. I think there's one reward for 100%ing each area. One reward for per area, I should say.
Okay.
And then there's there are 6 rewards across the 2 difficulties. One for just beating it on each difficulty, one for beating it on each difficulty within 8 hours, and one for beating it on each difficulty within 4 hours. And if you get like the next tier up, then the earlier tiers unlock as well. So if you got that 4-hour one, then the 8-hour and the just normal beating it will unlock as well.
Thankfully.
So yeah. So not as many playthroughs. Very interesting though, because usually you'd think that you'd want people to play your game more, so you'd make the endings more exclusive that way. But in terms of convenience sake, I think Nintendo knows their audience. They know that they're not going to have time to just play it over and over again. But like 3 playthroughs minimum, I'd say, and depending on how good you are, like 6 max, 7 max, maybe.
Well, and I think also on top of that is this is coming after a decade of trophies and achievements. So I know for a fact there are some games where the trophy is you need to beat it within this time frame, and then you need to beat it within this time frame. But getting, in some cases, in some games, they've done it where you get the earlier time frame or the harder time frame that would subsequently get you the other one, and they only give you the one.
Yep.
And I know for a lot of trophy people, that is the worst thing you could possibly do, because it's like, I do want to see if it's possible, and in some games it is, can I get platinum or can I get all the achievements in one playthrough, which can be pretty challenging depending on the game. I think on top of like the ambiguity being the difficulty in earlier Metroids, I think with a more open game, you can't be incredibly difficult at any point, because the designers don't know when you're going to be at that point.
Yeah.
So I think the only thing, and the reason why I thought about this question was, I think Fusion's linearity kind of helps it allow itself to become more difficult because it progresses a certain way.
Yeah.
And then it gives you more difficult things to try to take on as a result. And so because the game's constantly changing as you accomplish things or grab things, the earlier games don't really do that. And in a way, like in Super Metroid, until you get to Norfair, or Torian especially, like these are very simple enemies, and only once you get to the final area of the game do enemies stop dying after one hit from anything that you do. I think Dread, in some cases, they try to give you that heightened difficulty by improving certain fights, but otherwise I feel like Fusion kind of ups the difficulty as you progress, rather than waiting for a certain point and then being like, all right, let's go.
Well, it's a little hard to say, because with Fusion, I kind of look at let's say it in terms of like a graph. I'd say like in terms of like there's you start at the bottom, and like let's say in terms of the graph, um, the x coordinate is time played,
Yeah.
and the y coordinate is how easy the game is. So the higher it is, the easier the game is. So it starts off like low, and then it like goes up to like sort of like this meridian line here, and then it goes up, above that, and then it gets and then like maybe it gets a little bit harder and dips back down, but then you get an upgrade and it goes back
And it
up,
goes
but
back
then
up.
it dips back down again, and you get an upgrade and it dips back up. So it kind of like just stays at the same difficulty the entire time based on the upgrades you get. I feel like Fusion does that. I feel like though with Dread, in terms of the overall gameplay, you do start at that bottom point, because it's incredibly difficult to begin. You don't really know what you're doing. You're trying to learn as you go along.
Yeah.
And then it gets up to that point that I talked about before. Uh, and then, like, you get the upgrade, and then it keeps going up, but then you hit a boss battle, and it just dips back down. And I think that's really where the difficulty comes in. And I think that's like, and I think that's good because like the overall challenge of Metroid isn't traversing the area. The overall challenge, I would say, comes from the bosses.
Yeah.
And like the challenge um the challenge of like finding all the upgrades or like trying or figuring out where to go comes less from like reactionary speed and things like that. It more comes down to like memory or taking good notes or like
Yeah.
figuring out a puzzle in a certain way. um
They play very much like Mega Man bosses to me.
oh yeah. Except they don't have lack of weaknesses, except
Lack of
for one boss, but I won't go into
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
Uh, which I'm really frustrated myself. I didn't beat that boss that way. Anyway, uh, but yeah, I feel like where that graph goes is that it's basically just on a steady climb until you hit a boss, and then it dips to where it's like the most difficult thing ever because you don't know the boss's patterns.
Yeah.
And the boss, always hits like a truck. But then you
Mhm.
beat that boss, you get the new power up, and then it goes right back up to like that sort of like peak of ease. And then you're traveling for a little bit more. You have a lot of extra energy tanks. You have a lot of missiles. You don't have to like worry about that. Also, the Emmys as well, I think, kind of participate in that dip
Mhm.
into that harder range as well. Just because each one of them are different in terms of how they track you.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Uh,
that progressively gets more difficult as it goes along.
yeah. So overall, I feel like the exploration of the game isn't the hard part, except for the very beginning.
Yeah,
And most of the game's challenge comes from its bosses and navigating the Emmy rooms.
from the combat.
Yep.
Yeah. So moving on, just kind of going and talking about our overall thoughts on Fusion as well. But I think we talked about this a little bit. We'll go into it a little bit more. I know we're a little bit over, but that's okay. Adam kind of appears not just to give orders, but also to increase like the amount of dialogue and exposition. So now Samus has somebody to talk to, and that's how you progress the story now. Was this a
Yeah.
welcome change for you, or do you feel like this takes away from what Metroid is?
It takes away from what Metroid. Yeah, we talked about it before. I
Yeah.
feel like it takes away from what Metroid is. Um, I think it'd be better if it maybe I don't know how they could have improved on that in order to give like direction to the player other than introducing Adam. I feel like in terms of that regard, they probably did it as best as they could. But in terms of the overall Metroid experience, I think it takes away from it.
Mm-hmm. And then in our last episode, we talked about how visual elements in Super Metroid help tell its story rather than using text or dialogue to tell us what's going on. Do you think Metroid Fusion could have shown its story rather than told it to us?
It's To me, it all comes back to appealing to that casual audience.
Yeah, well,
Because
it's sort of like I remember back in the '90s, it was really popular to have picture books that had no text on it. I know that that's
yeah,
like only appealing to a certain demo of 5 or 6 year olds at the time. But and go on. I felt like I kind of interrupted you there, but
I guess like you wouldn't. Every Metroid game up until Fusion is always very is like the player is almost always in control.
Mhm.
And I guess and what I mean from that is that, like, Fusion as well, you're almost always in control, but there's a significant lack of control when you're in those situations where you're talking to Adam.
Mhm.
Like, okay, I did this. Now I have to go back to a navigation room to talk to Adam. Um, that kind of takes what you did. Actually, I guess depending on how it's interpreted, control could be varying. In Super
Yeah.
Metroid, it's like always you are in Super Metroid, you're always like in control, I guess, of like where you're going, and you never have to stop for dialogue boxes minus like power-ups. But that wasn't nearly as long as, say, like the dialogues with the AI in Fusion. Um, but in Fusion, it is very railroady. Uh,
Yeah.
like the what I guess it kind of does, honestly, is, like, let's say, like, you play through Metroid Fusion, you're like maybe like, I don't know, like 40% of the way through it. And you get to a point where you're just like stuck in terms of overall difficulty of like a boss or something. You don't have enough energy tanks, you don't have enough missiles or something like that. Well, the only thing you really have left to you is the areas that were already open. Oh my god, actually that doesn't make a very good point at all now that I think about it.
That's okay.
Because that's pretty much exactly how it works in Super Metroid. So yeah, no, that's not a very good point. Um, I guess the point I'm trying to make here though is just that the openness of past Metroid games is just not there in Fusion.
Mhm.
And for some, that could be considered a relief, as it gives you a direct path that you need to go on, that you can access. The that you where you're supposed to go to be able to do these things.
Mhm.
Um, what I think it doesn't allow, though, is the freedom for exploration to kind of do what you want. And I think of that more on a psychological level, because like when something points you where to go, and it's like that's the mission of the game is to get through there. You're going to want to get through there and not really worry about, say, like finding all the secrets in order to upgrade yourself to make some of those things
You wanna make
easier
the
in the
direct
future.
path.
Yeah, and I think that might I have no idea how many people gave up on Fusion, if it was like their first Metroid game or whatever, or if they're just not used to that style of gameplay. But I wonder how many people gave up because of that, because it's like, oh, because he's putting me in this direction, I should be able to beat it as I am now.
Oh, yeah, it's sort of like playing a level of Mario Brothers, which was also going back to that older conversation. It's like, I think that was the same issue that people had back in the 80s too, of when games became more open, like a JRPG. They just assume that whatever I have when I start the game is all I need in order to beat it. You don't think
Yep.
about having to need more things. And if the game is telling you to go from point A to B, like Mario Brothers kind of does, then that's all I need. I'm good to
Yep.
go. But yeah, I think in terms of like how it tells the story too is it's very easy to kind of like something happens when you get to point B, and then you talk to Adam about it and you have a dialogue about it, and then that furthers the story along too. And I feel like that's almost impossible to do with whatever they were trying to tell with Fusion. And I think even Dread too, like you still have to have these moments where something happens and then you update Adam on it, and then Adam talks to you. You don't talk back really, and then the story progresses from there. Super Metroid, because it's so contiguous, like there's no reporting back or anything. You're just constantly going. The story is able to kind of be told to you through nonverbal communication or through noises rather than actual dialogue.
Yeah, yeah. Although you did make me think of something as well. Going back to what I was saying about like the upgrades, and like, feeling as though that you're prepared for something because the game tells you to go do something.
Mm-hmm.
Dread really improved upon that by sort of driving home this helpless feeling. Adam would come up onto this thing and be like, "You are not ready to beat this guy."
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like that, like, again, psychological level. On a psychological level, I feel like that would drive players to try to look for the upgrades then.
Yeah.
Like, um, like Adam's being a jerk about it. He's being like, accept your futility, get back to your ship as soon as possible, but you're not going to be able to win against the bigger things that come along. And it's like, screw you. I'm gonna get more upgrades. I will become more powerful. I'm gonna be able to beat whatever comes my way. So like making the game seem more difficult than it is, I think drives the player to try to find things to make it easier.
Got it. Yeah. Metroid Fusion would kind of be the last Metroid game had Dread not premiered in 2021, almost 20 years later. How?
There is other M.
There is other M.
Because that is canon to the story.
It's canon to the story, but I feel like, you have a Metroid 4 and then you have an interquel in between. And so you don't really get to continue that narrative between 4 until Dread comes out.
That's true. It does take place before Fusion. Fusion really did seem kind of like an end, though, based on what happened to Samus, really.
Yeah, and it's sort of like this. It's a very weird circumstance too, because I feel like between Fusion and Dread, they sort of kind of explain. But anyway, how would you have felt if you knew Fusion was the last Metroid game ever? And are you happy with that Samus' story continues with Dread?
If it was guaranteed that Metroid Fusion was the last, like, let's say, let's say, try to think of how to put this, like, first party Metroid game or like whatever have you, because Prime basically like happened after Fusion, but it was sort of a different animal entirely.
Yeah.
Let's say if Fusion was the last game and they didn't introduce anything else, and they didn't do anything else with Prime, and that truly was the last Metroid game, I would think that it would probably be a very satisfied with the story's ending, but I would still want more Metroid. That very like unique gameplay, that style of game that coined the term Metroidvania. Other games would be able to fill the gap, like for it, but like there's something about franchises that I think people really get emotionally attached to. Other platformers can come out that would probably be exactly like Mario, but if it wasn't Mario, people wouldn't buy it as much, just because it doesn't have the name backing it. It doesn't have the investment of the nostalgia that you had for it way back when. And that's kind of how I feel about that. F-Zero is another one like that. There hasn't been an F-Zero game, at least a big F-Zero game, since GX. There have been like handheld ones, but like, and there was that Nintendo Land game, but we've seen things like, Redout or Fast Racing Neo and like all those other games that are basically Metroid or F-Zero clones.
Yeah.
But there's something about F-Zero that's just like where you want it to be F-Zero. It actually wouldn't be a bad idea, considering everything else that Nintendo's done in terms of third-party developers, to have somebody else develop an F-Zero game.
Yeah, exactly. Which supposedly has or has not happened.
I forgot the second part of that question that you asked, though.
Well, are you happy that Samus' stories continue with Dread? And, not to get into spoilers, but like knowing what you know now.
I think they did a right direction with that, because that Metroid has never been about the story. It's been about the gameplay. But no matter what game there is, there's always some story behind it. People try to find continuations in Mario, for God's sake.
That's true.
When
there's
those
gotta be a
games,
timeline.
Yeah, I mean, like all those games generally just take place in their own vacuum. But in terms of continuing the story and sort of like making you feel invested in it, I guess, Dread does a really good job of that, just because there's a lot to go about with that. I think Fusion did not do a good job because everything's just told you through a cold, unfeeling AI or Samus's internal dialogue.
Yeah.
And even though there are other people in Dread, I feel like it's done in a way that still pushes that sense of isolation. Because you have dialogue with maybe like 1.5 friendly entities.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. things go awry, and then suddenly you're alone again, and like there's it still pushes that feeling of like isolation and almost despair, I'd say,
Yeah.
in a sense. And it's like it's almost like the world is coming down around you, and you're raising raising your blaster in one hand and a middle finger in the other to try to like to fight back against what's trying to bring you down. um it's in a way it's almost inspiring, but I feel like spite is not the most inspiring thing.
It can be a decent
Yeah,
motivator, but it's not the healthiest of motivators.
I think Dread did a really good job in balancing out story, gameplay, characters, and isolation.
And yeah, as we go back to that earlier question that I asked, that is what you keep coming back to. So as long as you're getting that, you feel fulfilled.
Yeah, I think Metroid as a whole is a game that's mostly built around its gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of the reason why Metroid Prime is one of my is really up there as one of my favorite Metroid games, because it used to just be like this 2D world, but now it's a first person shooter, and
Mm-hmm.
you're just on this planet with a bunch of ruins of you know the an extinct race that maybe not the player has a connection to, but the character does.
Yeah.
um and everything else is either wild or hostile.
Yeah, I mean, Prime, the first two games, mostly the first one, really
Yeah,
kind of harkens back to that earlier Metroid idea of we're going to show you things, especially with cutscenes, but we're going to show you the story. We're not going to give you exposition. We're not going to give you a wall of text to
exactly.
read in order to understand it, which can be off-putting to some. But as you're talking about, like, Metroid is a game centered around its gameplay. That really is Nintendo in a nutshell. I mean,
Yeah,
realistically, Metroid was a game whose whole design and its whole creation is based off I bet I could make a game that does this. And all it is just, can I do vertical and horizontal scrolling at one time? And that's the whole purpose. Like F-Zero was, can I make a racing game based off Mode 7 graphics? Super
yep.
Mario Kart, can I do that, but with two
with
people at the same time?
multiplayer. Yeah.
Like every time Nintendo makes a game, or especially a new franchise, I would almost say Splatoon notwithstanding, it's typically because it's from a game design perspective of, can I do this? And then we're going to make a game out of it. And to the point where I think like when they were working on Metroid 2 or 3, I think it was 2 or 3, but like the director of 3, I think, was mentioned by Gunpei Yokoi, who was like the producer of the first two games. And it was like, you're still working on Metroid? Like, you're still doing that? I thought we stopped doing that. Like, Nintendo's willing to throw away a franchise early on enough because, well, we're done. Like, there's nothing more to do with it from a gameplay perspective.
Going back to Splatoon, I can probably say like a what if thing. Probably not from a technological or like a really changing up the market perspective. But I bet Nintendo asked themselves, can we make a shooter that's not violent?
That's a good point. Well, and like, can we make like a fun competitive
shooter that's not violent? Yeah.
Yeah. There's that. Do you have any final thoughts on Metroid Fusion? Was there anything you wanted to discuss that we didn't?
Again, I haven't played it in quite a while, so like if there was something I wanted to discuss, it would have to go back to me going back and playing it. But I think we touched on everything. I think it's a good game. I feel like it was trying to capture a broader audience that it really didn't need to, and I do feel like it railroaded you a lot. But the overall challenge was still there. And like on a player psychological level, just seeing a blip on a map telling you where to go in a linear game just doesn't sit right with me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I feel like it's good in an open world game just because like it's like, yes, this is where you need to go. I mean, like I think, does Prime do that?
Prime does, but it does in the same way that Zero Mission does, where it's not telling you this is where you have to go, but it might cap. It might be that thing where it's like, you need this to progress. So like you go to an area and then there's a block, and then in that same room with the block, it gives you something else that you need to go to another room that was previously blocked. And
that
so
was
it's
also
like you need that and then go back here and then go back.
Prime was also around the time when games were trying to have more realism to them.
Yeah.
So like in Dread, the stuff that you could destroy is very well laid out. At least when you destroy like the initial thing covering it. So
Mm-hmm.
like you hit something with a missile and it'll turn into like whatever the block is. And it's like, okay, I need that power up in order to get through it. In Metroid Prime, you would have to like scan something and it would be like, oh, it's made out of this material. And you're just like, what does that even mean? The only thing you can glean from it is I need an upgrade to get through this. And that's it.
Yeah. I think in some cases they're like, oh, it has this like icon etched into it or something, and like, oh, that's how I know I need like the certain.
I don't think they did that in Prime though. They did that. They definitely did that in Dread. But everything in Prime was like, this is made out of this material.
Well, obviously anybody would know that Ultra Bombs, but yeah, I get you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with pretty much most of those points. Like, it is kind of a far and away like different from the typical Metroid experience, but I think again they really tried something with changing the atmosphere, changing Samus. Like, they could have just done Zero Mission first, honestly, and just after such a huge gap between games, go like, here's an upgrade of the original Metroid. Instead, they decided to let's go forward with the franchise and go completely balls to the wall insane, and we're just gonna like do all these things. And Samus has changed physiologically. We've upgraded like all the different looks and styles of this whole thing, and we're gonna change how Samus plays. And I think it was a very interesting experience from the get-go. Unfortunately, it's not. Again, it's not one that I've gone back to frequently, and I would also kind of blame the market for that.
Yeah.
I happen to be one of those kids that had a flash cart. I had one of the earliest flash carts, and so I played myself. And now I don't have $134 to spend on just the cartridge. So, there are certain issues as to that, but I think, probably not on the highest highs of my list of Metroid games, but
yeah,
I think a unique experience that whether you do it for story or not, I think it's good to play. There are definitely worse games that you could play just to experience how not as good as other games that it is.
I think something that I think a lot of game companies should invest in, as opposed to making, and like it'd be weird and interesting to see this, but I think something that a lot of game companies should invest in, and I'm hoping in Nintendo's case this continues through the Switch's life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Is whatever console they come out with next, the games that are on like Nintendo Switch Online for like the NES and the Super NES, and to a lesser extent with the expansion pass, the N64 and the Genesis, are still available because you have that subscription on that new system.
I really hope that that's why they did it. I really hope that, this is all speculation, but my assumption is that the reason the online service exists is to have a perpetual place so that they don't have to keep updating contracts. They don't have to keep renegotiating. Like, well, you said that this could only be released on the Wii U. Now we have a Switch. We'll
see on that one, just because like contracts still do expire. It's not they're in perpetuity in terms of like subscription services. But I'm just hoping, just because like they kind of realized their folly when people bought the old games on the Wii, and they had to buy them again on the Wii U.
Yep.
And then they came out with the Switch, and they're like, well, we can't just keep releasing these over and over again and having people buying them. Eventually, they're going to get wise and just stop buying them. So I think the subscription service is a good idea in some practice, but it's going to be very hard to pull off in some aspects because of licensing, and others because hardware that's developed later is going to be so vastly different that the console. You might still have your Nintendo Online account, but the console might not launch with like NES and Super NES and N64 games and whatnot, because they've got to make sure everything is working on that new hardware.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm hoping for the best with this service, despite opinions on the expansion pass,
despite a $50 price tag for ROMs.
It's a different episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks so much for coming. We are at the end. This is the end of the month of Metroid. Well, especially since November is only a couple days away. But Thank you so much for coming and just talking with me for quite some time here about this game.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I got a little controversial at the end there, but yeah,
No,
it
it's
just means I'm never coming back.
no. This guy. Where can our viewers find you, and what are you up to?
Oh, I produce Let's Play content on youtube.com/Tom Fawkes. Currently, at the time of this recording, I'm doing a 100% Let's Play of Sonic Adventure 2 DX, and as much of 100% Let's Play as possible of The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, featuring my I'm gonna call him an orc chef, because I talked about his alchemy skill being him making sandwiches.
Okay.
But yeah, it's Greg the Orc. It's like half Let's Play, half sort of like role play session, because sometimes I'll do little voices to interact with the other characters in the world. Aside from that, I do vlogs. I try to put them out weekly, but I'm a bit behind. I just dumped a whole bunch of them on YouTube now, but they're coming up periodically. I post a bunch of my stream VODs. You can find those streams over at twitch.tv/Tom Fawkes. And I also make a Smash Bros series. Try to do weekly, but it was on a bit of a hiatus for a while, of Smash Bros maps and game modes that I make, called Custom Smash. And that should be new episodes every Saturday, but it might not always be the case in that regard.
Yeah.
And if you want updates on all that, the best way to find that is twitter.com/Tom Fawkes.
Awesome. As for me, you can find more episodes here at youtube.com/LaughingboyLP. You can also find the show on Spotify. Search for DialogBOX, all one word. It's also on most other podcast services that you can get your grubby little paws on. You can also find me on Twitter at LaughingboyLP for updates and, me complaining about things. But, if you've gotten this far, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like. You can subscribe for more episodes and content updates. If you're watching this on a VOD, thank you so much for watching this. And just remember that you can always catch this on a stream on youtube.com/LaughingboyLP. And be sure to leave a comment. What did you guys think of the month of Metroid? Should I do more series like this in the future? Let me know down below. But until then, see you next time. Goodbye. Good night.
Farewell.
I'm pressing the button. Auf Wiedersehen.